Thank you everyone for joining us for Map the Truth, a discussion about ways we can dispel misconceptions through uplifting truth around the struggles we face because of COVID-19. I'm Cristian Perez, the Manager of Media Strategy at the Opportunity Agenda, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Today, we're really excited to talk about Map the Truth, a COVID-19 social justice guide developed by Can't Stop, Won't Stop Consulting, Advancement Project National Office, Asian Pacific Islander American Health Forum, Demos, and the Opportunity Agenda. You can find this guide at www.mapthetruth.com and engage in the conversation by posting about this guide using hashtag #MapTheTruth. And of course, we're active on social media, so feel free to post during this conversation. I have the distinct pleasure today to be joined by two speakers who will tell us a little more about the Map the Truth discussion guide. First, we're going to have Gregory Sandana, President and co-founder of Can't Stop, Won't Stop Consulting, and Zerlyn Hughes-Spruill, Managing Director of Communications for Advancement Project National Office. We will take your questions toward the end of the webinar, so please enter any questions you have in the questions function on the GoToWebinar toolbar. After the webinar, there's going to be a short evaluation to see what we did, what we need to improve upon, and we're asking you to fill that out before we get going. To get things started, I'm going to throw this over to Greg. Greg, would you like to get us started?
Yes, thank you so much for the introduction and for everyone for joining us. As Christian mentioned, this was an effort that actually was built off of initial social justice guide that the Advancement Project and the Opportunity Agenda started. And so along with these other partner organizations, we felt like the pandemic and the current moment created another opportunity to provide like the next iteration of the guide that specifically talked about the ways in which we were talking about COVID-19, the coronavirus, and the impact that it was having on communities of color and marginalized communities. We know the impact of this global pandemic has exacerbated the systemic inequities that exist here in the United States. And one of our goals through this guide is to really fight the spread of misinformation, fear, and hate that is further targeting immigrants and people of color and affecting already marginalized communities. And we believe that this resource will help folks navigate through messaging and language designed to bring us together. And that we believe the best way to dispel misconception is to uplift the truth with care and the love that we have for our people and our communities and our families. Next slide, please. From the more than 2,066 Asian Americans as of June who reported racist incidents against them, to the people of color, women, and members of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer community, and working people, and all of the people who live at the intersections of those identities, who lack a living wage, access to healthcare, quality food. It is important for us to really consider the narrative frames and stories that we're trying to convey that could really address the challenges that folks are facing, the threat of being born, the threats that are being born from multiple systems of oppression, and the racism that is being lifted up, and the necessity for all of us to work together. Next slide, please. Even in the midst of the chaos and crisis, and as we are in the midst of one of the most critical elections and the two major parties preparing to have their conventions in the coming weeks, this resource could be used to lead with truth and to lead with positivity and to ensure humanity is at the center of our focus once again. And we chose the concept of the map because we know that we will chart our collective path forward together to take action, to find solutions, and to really live out our values. Next slide. And we're very clear, like with every action, with every statement, we have two choices, and that we must be clear that it can start and stop with us. And we're particularly excited that you all have really decided to join us as we map out the truth and map out the truth together. Thank you.
Now, Really quick, before we move on from this slide, this slide reminds me of the they go low, we go high notion. Something that I know is something that we hear a lot, but at times it can be very tiring to keep going high. And I guess the question is, what advice do you have for people who are feeling exhausted in these times when taking the high road just seems tiring?
Well, as it relates to communications work, I can speak to the fact where it is us that are, we have to control the message. We have to take hold of that narrative. So even if, we're like, knocking on people's doors and reminding them, you got to say it this way, or editing someone's work in a certain fashion to remind them over and over again, just do it. When it comes to, kind of stepping away from the communications work and just being very reflective, you do have to step back. But, it's hard to step back during this time. And we're going to see stuff on Twitter. We're going to see stuff on Facebook and in our conversations. And it really is our duty to say something and to map the truth.
Yeah, I mean, just one thing that I would add to what Zerlene said is, I think it's important that we have to make an assessment of our energy, where we put the energy, and also that dynamic with the potential person or people that we are going to talk with. Or I think depending on the relationship and depending on how much you're willing to invest to kind of help move or inform folks, I think will help you determine how much energy you should put in. And I believe anyways, that everyone has a role, and there are different ways that we can support and different ways that we can encourage people to map out the truth better. And so whether it's actually engaging and going back and forth and wanting to have that conversation, I think this is a tool that can support that. Or it's also designed for people to kind of look at it on their own. So like if you say, actually, well, I would like to offer this resource as something that we could share with you to kind of think about or reframe maybe how you're talking about a particular topic or issue. So that's another way that I would think about it.
Yeah. Now, and of course, we're going to get into all of this in the coming slides. So keep listening for some tips about how to keep the truth out there. I think just kind of reiterating as well that if we want to move past the time that we're in, if we want to move into a time where we can actually get solutions that speak to our communities, we really need to avoid the traps that are kind of set out there. So anyways, Zerlene, I'll let you resume.
Thank you. So while the guide is 42 pages, they are presented in graphic slides, very digestible, very shareable. So don't forget to use your social media accounts to spread the word about Map the Truth. Use the hashtag #MapTheTruth and the website mapthetruth.com. The guide is divided into several sections: finding solutions and hope, taking actions and living our values, leading with truth and possibility, which is most of what we'll be presenting from today, in addition to making comparisons, imagery guidance, and we've got some additional resources. So to start, in recent days, we've been hearing people call the virus out of its name, the Rona or Miss Rona, to lighten the burden to those who have lost loved ones. And it's not really helpful, though. Even more harmful, however, is giving the virus slang terms that give rise to harmful stereotypes. So we really do need to end the use of these and call out others whose terms are listed in this particular section. I don't want to read them out, but you can see them. And so when I say calling out people, I mean your friends, your family, those of us who have media networks, them as well, and other influencers. Next. Another do, we want to affirm that no one has brought the virus. It is, in fact, a contagion that has spread. Also, the statement continues to be unfound. Transmission of the virus is confirmed through respiratory droplets, hence the reason we're all walking around with our masks. And we must avoid conspiracy theories and repeating conservative and untrue rhetoric. So let's not feed the myth. Next.
Yes, I know this has come up a lot, where when people are describing the current crisis or moment that we're in, there are some that have used words that are commonly associated with people with intellectual disabilities, and those could be seen as providing a negative connotation to those who are directly impacted by those disabilities. And so one offering that we have is to use words like trying or turbulent or challenging times that we're in, versus some of the other words that you may see here on the screen. Next slide.
So Black folks have been hit hard, but it's simply not because we're Black. Dr. Fauci, the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, was quoted as saying, health disparities have always existed for the African American community. Coronavirus is shining a bright light on how unacceptable that is, because yet again, when you have a situation like the coronavirus, they are suffering disproportionately. We will get over the coronavirus, but there will still be health disparities, which we really do need to address in the African American community, unquote. So Black people, brown people contracting the virus at higher rates is about neighborhoods. It's about neighborhoods with a lack of healthy food options, also known as food deserts. It's about the lack of green spaces and recreational facilities and equitable healthcare. All these things are known as structural racism. Furthermore, essential workers are overwhelmingly Black and brown, working in factories, warehouses, grocery stores, where there's frequent daily contact with others. And that's another cause for the disproportionate rates in the virus. And we should also be thinking about the families these workers come home to, who are exposing their households upon the return from work every day. But Gregory will talk a little bit more about that. Next.
Yes, definitely. That, we want to also affirm that while healthcare workers are definitely on the front lines and are essential, are playing essential roles, that there are quite a few other essential roles in frontline workers that are out there. Janitors, delivery employees and truck drivers, restaurant and factory workers, pharmacists, teachers, mental health and social workers, garbage collectors, postal workers, grocery store clerks, farm workers, scientists, lab techs, airline and airport staff, caregivers, and the list goes on and on. So it's important that we're thinking about folks who play in the variety of sectors, and to know that 9 million people in the frontline workforce are people of color, immigrants, with many of the most impacted sectors being women. Next slide. And so it's an important part to really evoke our communal responsibility to protect essential workers over appealing to audiences' self-interest. As shared, there are a range of services and benefits that all workers should have access to, but they are especially critical for those who are designed essential, especially in a pandemic, and for services that many of us are relying on to ensure that we get the care and the food and the important things for us to survive this pandemic. Next slide.
So we've all gotten used to the idea of distancing ourselves and using the term physical distancing, which is great. But the next step to help us understand that we still want to be in community at this time is to take the word physical out and replace it with social. Distancing is easier, when we're thinking about it from a perspective of, all right, we're still trying to be in community. We still want to see our friends and our families. We still want to make sure that our children, for example, are maintaining relationships. So I think it's really important that social distancing replaces the term physical distancing. Further, distancing is easier for some community members than others. Those who are incarcerated or held in detention, along with those who work in close quarters, again, are essential workers, cannot. The racial demographic of these populations is largely comprised of people of color, and when it comes down to it, distancing is a privilege that many cannot practice. Next. Also from our Leading with Truth and Positivity section of the guide is the recommendation of using health-specific terms instead of battle or war, akin to the very popular misuse of war on drugs, which was unfortunately answered with over-policing instead of a nationwide public health response. Next.
Yes. And as we discussed, we know that COVID-19 is impacting and affecting Black and Brown communities at much higher rates. And so the vaccination gaps could have devastating effects on our communities. So building trust and building credibility is critical. And it's also important as we think about, moving forward, to emphasize that availability of a safe and effective vaccine must be accessible, must be available to anyone who wants it, and that cost really should not be a barrier. Another note on this is that we should really rely on credible medical professionals, community support organizations, and other trusted validators who serve Black and Brown communities to really carry the message of vaccine safety and efficacy while acknowledging the history of racist medical malpractice and experimentation. And I think especially as there is more research that's coming out, as people are getting more anxious because it's, of course, we're now months into this pandemic, it's gonna be really important that we keep that in mind. Next slide, please. So another section of the guide is where we talk about some of the comparisons that are used and being made. And one of those comparisons that I'll just lift up as part of this example is kind of the stay-at-home orders, which are being used to enforce our health and safety and that of our community. And people who are being told to stay at home for their and others' safety, at the end of the day, still have the ability and freedom to go outside or leave. For example, people who are incarcerated do not. And so when we think about comparing or saying like stay at home is like being in prison, that may not be a proper comparison to make. And so there are other examples that are listed specifically in the guide, but wanted to just give one of those examples now. Next slide, please. And so another part of this guide is imagery guidance. There is more information that you can find in the Map the Truth guide, but the note here is that images are powerful and are a key tool, we believe, in really changing the narrative. And so certain images are often a key component in criminalizing people of color. And so we must be careful in all the instances to really illustrate like what is going on in our communities by using accurate photographs and graphics and video footage. And when talking about the coronavirus, particularly related to its introduction to society, there's no need to post, a photo of a particular homogenous group. And further, when talking about those who succumb to the disease, making sure to not further victimize a particular population, nor pit one population over another, and to seek and publish images of families together versus like mugshots as another example, or potentially dehumanizing images that inherently imply criminality. And so I think our point here is, in addition to the words and the narrative frames, images can play a powerful role in like what stories we are trying to tell. Next slide. So those are the kind of that was an overview and kind of a snapshot of the kind of big different sections, but as Darlene mentioned, it's more than 40 pages. And so definitely invite folks to read and share as appropriate.
Yeah, and remember, all of these materials are available at www.mapthetruth.com. If you sign up for this webinar, you also get a PowerPoint. If you have any questions, please submit them into the chat. We're open for discussion now about some of the specific points. I think one of them was, some of them have already been answered, but just kind of reiterating, www.mapthetruth.com. You can see the full 40-page report, along with social media graphics and a one-pager that describes this as well as listing the various organizations who helped put this together. One of the questions that came up, which I think speaks to the definition of essential workers, was specifically about teachers. So there was a slide, I think it was slide 13 and 14, which focused specifically on essential workers and broadening the definition of what essential workers means. When I think essential workers, I did a lot of work with supermarket workers and helping them ensure hazard pay and proper protective equipment. And so in my mind, I'm drawn towards a lot of supermarket workers who are, in the beginning of this especially, were not given the protections that were really needed because they weren't deemed as essential. However, I think this kind of hits the point of broadening that definition. So I guess to that, Greg or Zerlene, if you have any thoughts on broadening the definition of essential workers, specifically, as someone mentioned, teachers.
Yeah, I think it's an important it's important to broaden that, because I think especially now as folks are preparing to go back to school and folks are wrestling with, should schools reopen? And if schools reopen, the parents, guardians, and families are debating, should my children or students go back to school? And so I think that there's a lot of questions about our schools resourced properly with the personal protective equipment. Is there the training to ensure that teachers, educators, and students are going to be safe and healthy? And what other resources is our state and federal governments also providing, who are kind of pushing or encouraging schools to reopen? And so I think even before the reopening, though, and even as folks are managing, trying to navigate and manage kind of distance learning, I know many educators who talked about the struggle of, and who saw even more of those barriers to what happens if a family doesn't have technology to use or access to broadband or wireless, or what if there are multiple people in a household that now have to get support from the same parents or guardians, and how do educators support them? And I think that many of the people that I'm in community with are also parents who have really talked about how much more they are appreciative of educators, especially in this moment, because of the additional responsibilities that they've had to have since the rise of the pandemic. And so I think it's important that we also ensure and are including educators as part of the definition of essential workers.
Yes, and I would agree with that, particularly because our teachers, they really look forward to their summer breaks. And I don't think there's a teacher around the country who has had a break, because they have been deep diving into the tools, the virtual tools that they're going to need to work on. I know for a fact that there's been several meetings around the clock. They've been working on enrolling students online, not just teachers, but faculty members, and still opening campuses to collect and give out computers, laptops for the coming school year. So absolutely, indeed, they are considered.
Yeah, and someone brought up the notion of the physical distancing versus social distancing, and just kind of assess that out. The idea is we want to emphasize physical distancing because we can still be social. As you can see, we're socializing right here, but we can still be social without having to be physically present. Is that correct?
So the idea is that so many people right now are feeling isolated, and we want to make sure that people understand they can still be in community. They can still be social and engage and interact. They just need to maintain a physical distance where there's, 6 feet apart. But instead of, words really matter. And if people are thinking, physical distance, I can't touch you, I can't, see you, that may prove traumatic for many people. So I think the social aspect is just a reminder to not be at the parties that we're seeing a lot of on the news, to not, to instead have the Zoom parties, for example. I know that I actually have a weekly happy hour on Zoom. And I know a lot of other people are doing something like that, even with our jobs, to stay social with our coworkers. But the idea is just, kind of changing the narrative again, letting people know that we can get through this, and we just need to do it differently. But words matter. We're walking around in the grocery stores, and number one, we can't see each other's faces because the masks are on. We don't know if we're smiling at each other. Then we've got these squares on the ground in the grocery store telling us to stay away. So we're already getting all this stay away, arm's length. So I think that's what that's based in.
And I think also one of the challenges that I've seen a lot of is a lot of these myths that we're challenging in this guide, which you can find at mapthetruth.com. A lot of them are actually also being perpetuated in the media. So you have either prominent electeds or just pundits who will use terminology that is very problematic. How do you advise approaching the challenging of these mistruths, especially if they're like in the headline of an article?
Yeah. Well, I would first start by saying, before you share an article, to make sure you read the article and go beyond the headline, because sometimes, sometimes referred to as clickbait, folks purposely put certain headlines so that people can click on it without actually knowing the content that they're pushing. So I would just first and foremost name that. I think if you do happen to see mistruths, including in headlines, I'll put one potential approach is to actually reach out to the reporter and to say, reporter, I found this language particularly challenging and even harmful, and this is why. And hopefully that the Map the Truth guide could actually give you some potential talking points or reasons of what you can include there. And then I think furthermore, it always would be, I think, helpful to also include our own narratives. So if you actually see an article, use that as an opportunity to write a letter to the editor, or even an opinion editorial if you're able to write a longer response to kind of talk about like why words are so important and why we are choosing or trying to offer alternate messages or narratives or message frames instead. And so I think that's one way to do it.
We got an audience question, and remember, feel free to put your questions in the question function of GoToMeeting. This question is, what about reentry? When young people went into the world was different. How do you help youth and families with the transitions along with the issues COVID-19 has presented? So I guess in response to that, I kind of also adding to the question, like how is the narrative different for young people versus the older generation or the seasoned generation? Like how do we distinguish the types of wording that we're using cross-generationally?
That's a good question. I think it's challenging because our young people are already used to a version of social distancing, using Snapchat still, using Discord and all the other chat devices where they are used to seeing each other on screen. And I think now, more than ever, they are realizing, wait a minute, I kind of miss that social interaction at school and going out to, the movies and such. So I think more important than the messaging is what we're actually doing with them. I'm the mother of 2 teenagers, and I've actually been trying to get my young people out of the house and reintegrating them with their friends, but chaperoned in a way that I can make sure that they're keeping their distance, but still being social. And so I think the wording around that is, or the narrative is basically letting folks know you can still go out, but there's a way to do it.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that I would say is, the reality is that some people do not want to go back to what the world was like pre-COVID. And so I actually ask people like, well, how can we actually push people to reimagine or rethink the systems and the way that the world operates, like in a post-COVID world, and to use this opportunity to say, well, we know that there are these holes and gaps in healthcare, in education, in the economy, and even how the voting system works. And so if we could use this moment to learn and to push each other and to engage in critical dialogue about what those systems could look like and should look like, to be inclusive, to be accessible, to allow for it to also benefit and not just harm, like people of color, women, and LGBTQ folks. I think that's one way to think about it. And then I think that it's also important that we really hone in and focus on mental health, because, you know, I also know that especially for younger folks, like the opportunities to be in community at schools and to be with friends is an important part of, at least for me, was an important part of my growth, and like an important part of just what my experience was as I moved through school. And so if there's a moment now where we know that like there may be like multiple folks who have a year, maybe 2 years, or like long periods of time where they don't have that opportunity to be in community, what are other and different kinds of ways, like Darlene mentioned, where we could try to help facilitate and support that. And so I think this is giving us an opportunity to also rethink and reimagine how we operate, and trying to encourage folks to think outside the box and maybe be innovative, and to be open to doing things that maybe that weren't done or seen as traditional before.
Yeah, and following along that same vein, someone else asked, what do you recommend as resources, guidance, etc., to youth leaders outside the U.S. who are being impacted by untruths in the U.S., either accepting it as fact/appropriate language or experiencing increased fear and anxiety based on untruths? How do you address the cultural context and untruths?
That's an interesting question. I think there are some very exciting reporters and outlets that are around right now that are offering alternates, that are offering resources to help people through the pandemic. One of them would be Teen Vogue. They've got such a great platform and voice, and their articles are great, and they really know who to include in their coverage. There's something currently about activists. And I think looking to those activists, the young activists, would be a really great option for young people in the US and outside of the US to understand how they're going about advocating for themselves, how they're going about moving through this time, and what they were doing even prior to the pandemic to feel empowered to deal with untruths and myths and to break barriers. So I would suggest resources like that.
Yeah, I think the only other thing that I would add is the importance of really learning and building with Native and Indigenous folks. Because I think that, at least in my experiences, and especially as we are using this moment to kind of reimagine or rethink, there are actually certain practices or certain ways of being that were around and that Indigenous peoples and Native folks have been able to carry on, and that may have gotten lost as colonization and other systems of oppression kind of started to erase some of those stories and histories. And so I would also think about like that as a form of grounding, that, you know, even hundreds of years ago, even before there was this advanced amount of technology and whatnot, that there were certain ways of being. And so that's been one way, and one thing that I would offer, you know, for young people, whether here or across the globe, to kind of think about.
Yeah, and I also kind of remind. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I just wanted to correct myself. So Teen Vogue is doing the exciting work relaying information, news, and even putting the voices of teens in their magazine, but it is Vogue that currently has the cover piece on activists in the Black Lives Matter movement.
No, I was gonna say, it's also an interesting notion about how we're in a moment as well where a lot of us can kind of capture and disseminate our own stories as it relates to these matters. And this guide kind of is helpful for ensuring that as much as possible we're talking about the issues impacting us in a way that will hopefully shift the way people are using problematic language. Like, it's the same thing, like the story, what are the stories that we're going to tell about these times? Right now we're in the moment where we're putting together the stories, and if we think about how to tell it in a way that does not, kind of push any mistruths or suppress any certain communities, then that, like, something to kind of think about. Comment from, just want to highlight a comment that we are getting. Someone commented, really great point post-COVID. We are examining what policies need to change that are barriers to social justice. We call those policies anti-social justice as in anti-racist. Great discussion panel, thank you. And then a question we have, speaking of positivity, what do you say about cancel culture and its impact? I mean, I also cancel culture. Speaking of positivity, what do you say about cancel culture and its impact? And I mean, I'm not sure if it's a political statement to say that I'm no longer using Goya products. That's just casually putting it out there. But what are your thoughts on cancel culture?
Yeah, so I will start by saying that, oh, can you hear me? Okay, yeah, I would start by saying that I think cancel culture. I think that there's an approach that I think that it's mindful to think about what our goal is and what our relationship is with the person that we are potentially canceling, right? And I think in some cases, at least what I've seen, because of social media, there's been a lot of, at least interpersonally, a lot of people canceling or calling out folks in a way that I think could potentially be seen as unhealthy, because there's either not a relationship, there wasn't any like willingness to work with each other beforehand. And so I don't know how helpful it is for folks to be able to like lift up or to kind of add fuel to the fire, if you will, as it relates to that. I do think that if there is a relationship and then that there is an ability to to really call people in with love and care, and that you could be able to engage in a conversation, the social media may not be the best place for it, and that's something that you could do outside of the public sphere. Now, I think that when you, in the example that you just gave, Christiane, about like Goya or other things, I do think that people also have to be mindful that putting things out there also means that you also have the ability to be criticized for it. And so, if a company or someone aligns themselves with a decision that was made, or a political figure who happens to say racist, xenophobic, and misogynistic things, that you have to be prepared for the potential backlash that may come from that. And that because of social media, because of technology, and because now folks are on that technology even more so because of the pandemic, there's even likely more chances for those things to spread, but also spread quickly and exponentially in a short amount of time. And so it's important that people recognize that when they start to align or say things. And that's just one thing that I like to like offer and share with folks as they're thinking about what to say or not say, especially in the public sphere.
Yeah, and I mean, I think kind of connected to that, how much do you think this guide should be incorporated into our social media voices? Because obviously, as you can, many of us have seen, social media probably has a lot more language that is a lot harder to mitigate. So I guess what do you think the role is, both as like us as individuals, but also as us as like consumers of social media, in ensuring better language is used?
Well, the tenets in the guide are based in love, truth, and positivity. It's unfortunate that we have to have a guide to remind folks to do that. So, you know, we should be doing this on a regular basis, pandemic, crisis or not. The other piece, of course, is using social media responsibly and not using it, not relying on it as a source to get your feelings out, or even as a source to get your news on a very regular basis. We should also be, again, in community, talking with each other, throwing back ideas and learning and seeing from a real life person what works and what doesn't. And luckily for our organizations that are involved on this project, we do a lot of grassroots work and we do a lot of talking. We do some surveying and polling as well, but we do want to be authentic with the people that we're working for, the impacted people that we're working on behalf of when we're doing our work in voting rights and immigrant justice, and of course in creating materials for folks to use, whether it's the media, advocates, activists, whomever. So when it comes to the social media, we're hoping that, or I'm actually hoping that this guide is helpful. I'm hoping that it gets into the right hands. So I'm really glad to see folks asking about teachers and education and our young people, and also folks across the pond or wherever else around the world.
Yeah, and my hope is that folks are able to utilize Map the Truth in any of the ways that they interact with folks. From social media, maybe it's the tabletop conversations with your family, maybe it's on that Zoom happy hour with your friends that Darlene does weekly. You know, like I think that there are a lot of different avenues and ways to utilize the guide. And I think part of the intent is that whether we're speaking to one other person, a group of people using our social media, that we are conscious of that language, conscious of the narratives that we are using, and hopefully that we could be able to continue to uplift. Because I think the reality is, and especially in this moment, and especially in this highly politicized environment, there's a lot more negativity and a lot more hate that's being spewed, and so we're really trying to remind folks of humanity, remind folks that love, and reminds folks of that positivity is going to be not only a helpful balance, but will continue to encourage folks and ground folks and bring us together.
Yeah, and so I guess so one thing, someone asked a question about whether these slides will be shared. The slides will be shared after the webinar as well as the recording. And of course, you kind of to reiterate, we have, I think, 20 slides that are featured on this PowerPoint. If you go to www.mapthetruth.com, the whole PDF is there. Like, it's a 44-page PDF, and it has more details. There's a couple slides in here we actually had to merge because of timing, but there's more details for each of the sections, and like you can get into. There's also a list of resources. So if you go all the way to the end of the guide, there's a list of resources that I'd highly recommend you click through. So we cited where you can get more details, and of course, help share this. Use hashtag #MapTheTruth to help share this out, because we need to kind of get this positive messaging out there so that we can kind of shift how we're talking about these issues to center, well, hopefully positive results. And I think one of the slides I think really, well, hit home for me. Like, all of the slides hit home. But one of the slides that Darlene actually kind of talked about was war, or like how we're describing these times. Because I will admit, sometimes like I'll talk about the crisis, the war on working class people, like what we are experiencing in this time. However, as you mentioned, we have to emphasize it's a struggle, because historically, war on drugs is what created such a problematic and horrible criminal justice system that exists today. So you can see literally how that phrase manifested into this massive behemoth of a problem that we still have to handle. So how do you think that kind of a phrase, that phrasing specifically, in terms of galvanizing these times, connects to this crisis and the importance of highlighting the struggle and the collective involvement in the struggle?
Mm. Well,
I see you making eyes. Who's gonna go first?
Go ahead, Sterling.
I do feel like it's problematic, and I think that, you know, we all watch these movies and they make us fearful of what could potentially happen, you know, going through checkpoints on a very regular basis moving forward. So I want to make sure that we are not policed. And I also know that Black and brown bodies would be the ones policed more than any others moving forward, as we are right now. So changing the culture, changing the language is really important. As mentioned, there should be no war on blank, and we should be focused more on the public health aspect and how our public health officials are going to be able to respond and work with our local folks and our federal folks to make sure we are protected, knowledgeable, and trusting.
Yeah. And I think more broadly, yeah, with the coronavirus, you know, and the health crisis that it's created, that racism and police violence is a virus too. And that I think, especially because Black and brown folks are feeling the impact of that at many different levels, that part of our conversations and part of how we're trying to shift language is also helping people shift, like, what are the policies and what is this new and different world? The reality is that, especially many of us working in social justice spaces, is that many of us believe that we needed universal health care. Many of us believe that folks should have access to food and water. And many people believe that that there should be quality education and funding for critical programs like that. But I think in this moment, there's a lot of folks being politicized, and a lot of folks, their eyes are opening to just how what the lack of resources actually look like and how it's impacting them, especially in this moment. So there's a short window here, I think, for us to not only encourage and uplift this unifying language and message that we have within Not the Truth, but to also encourage folks to think bigger and to think broader and to think more inclusively around the types of policies that we could pass. And especially because we are in an election, and especially because people are going to be trying to galvanize folks to vote, that this is the time to really push folks at all levels of government, and as movement, to be a part of movements and efforts that are going to be pushing folks around these issues. And so we hope that this guide will be an impetus and a way to be able to encourage folks to have even more of those conversations and get you involved in any of these organizations and many of the organizations that we are in community and partner with.
And on that note, I think we're going to wrap it up. So I want to say thank you again to all the groups who were involved in making this all happen. Thank you, Greg and Zerlene, for making yourselves available to help describe all. I can't emphasize. You'll see all of the information, plus the footnotes, plus, like I said, check it out. And what's helpful is kudos to the designer. It's a very, as you can tell, like it's a very easy to read. You can flip through it very quickly. Like I say 44 pages, but it's really quick read. Like I'd recommend check it out. There's some cool graphics that are included as well as some more examples of how this language can be used. So just have to say, like I said, go to www.mapthetruth.com to find out more and share this. Help us get it out there at #MapTheTruth. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me directly. My email is cperez@opportunityagenda.org. I'm also on Twitter @ChristianPerez. As you close the GoToWebinar, before Zerlene and Greg, do you have anything to say before we signed off?
No, just glad to see everybody here, and let's spread the word.
Thank you so much for having us. Thanks, folks, for joining, and we look forward to really spreading this message and moving forward together.
Thank you as well for your time. And when you sign off this GoToWebinar, there's a quick survey. Please fill it out. We use that survey to help keep our webinars active and engaging. So your input is greatly appreciated. And once again, thank you to everyone who helped make this happen.